the best of the week on Relevant Radio.
Let's move on to the gospel. I've explained all the stuff I don't know about the first reading. Now let's go discuss what I don't know about the gospel. The very first day of the week, which of course is Sunday, 2 of Jesus' disciples were going to a village 7 miles from Jerusalem, Emmaus. The town thought of as Emmaus is some 20 plus miles from Jerusalem now. That's a problem. We also don't really know, though there are strongly held opinions in the Holy Land. We don't really know where Emmaus is. There's a place that the early Christians seem to think it was, but we don't know. There's another thing that we don't know from the readings. Moving along here, well, these 2 disciples are walking along and they're conversing and they're walking, and Jesus himself drew near and walked with them, but their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So he asked them. They don't recognize it's Jesus, and they're his disciples. Not only are they his disciples, he asked them, "What are you discussing as you walk along?" They stopped, looked downcast. One of them, Cleopas, said to him in reply, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know these things?" Now, this was a pilgrimage holiday, and so people would go up to Jerusalem to visit. And it was just ending the Passover. I want to look up that word for visit. I didn't look it up. You know, as I do these things, I see words that just intrigue me, and I should look that up. So, all right. He says, "Are you the only one who's outside the city of Jerusalem?" The paroikis means to visit, but it means someone from outside the city. So, are you the only one on the outside who was in the city visiting, who doesn't know about these things? What things? Well, what happened to you? Well, who's this Cleopas? You know, it's interesting. The Acts of the Apostles, I think it's interesting. The Acts of the Apostles and the book of Luke, they are clearly 2 volumes of one work. They're both addressed to Your Excellency Theophilus, and Dr. Brant Pitre, whom I always tell you is a very smart cookie. He's a great scholar. Dr. Brant Pitre makes the point that there was an Excellency Theophilus, Kratiste Theophilus. The word Kratiste means most excellent, and it was a title directed at government officials or religious officials. It's kind of Your Excellency. Who is this Your Excellency Theophilus? Well, he was the youngest of the sons of Annas and had been high priest. And I wonder if he wasn't the high priest who delegated Paul to go clean up this mess in Damascus with these Christians. And Paul came back a Christian. He didn't quite come back, but he accepted Christ. And there was a suit lodged against Paul. And the Roman system of justice was there was kind of a drop-dead date, where if the suit was not dropped, the charges were not dropped, the trial had to go on. And I wonder if the book of Luke and Acts were not written aimed at this particular Theophilus. That seems to be Dr. Pitre's theory, and I think it's the theory of other real scholars. This was a legal document. It's the best Greek in the New Testament, and it's a legal document. The opening line of Luke has things about eyewitnesses and attendance at the court case. They'd say ministers of the word. That can be translated attendance of the court case. It's clearly, at least in its nucleus, a legal document to get whoever lodged the suit against Paul, possibly this high priest Theophilus, to drop the suit. And it mentions, it seems to focus around the temple, and it mentions all these names who Theophilus would have heard about. Remember, this is 50 years before the fact, some of it. So they're names that the author of the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, whom I believe to be Luke, drops names, and this is a name he drops, Cleopas. Who's Cleopas? He was, apparently, the strong tradition is, the brother of Saint Joseph. He was identified in both Catholic and Eastern Orthodox tradition as Cleopas, Cleophas, and possibly Alphaeus. They're 3 different names. No, they're not. my first name, Richard, I'm called Rich, I'm called Rick, I'm called Dick. How do you get that out of Richard? You do. So, this Cleopas was apparently a member of the family of Jesus. They don't mention the other disciple, probably because it was a woman, and women couldn't testify in court. That's interesting because the witnesses to the resurrection, the first witnesses, were women. If that had been a false account, they would have made the witnesses to the resurrection or to the empty tomb, they would have made them men. But they didn't. They told the truth, that it was the women who first found the tomb empty. But they're not going to mention some woman who's walking with Cleopas. They'll mention Cleopas or Cleopas. And very interestingly, that I think it was the son of Cleopas who ended up as a bishop of Jerusalem. The bishops of Jerusalem were always from the family of Jesus. It's very interesting. We get that from the writings of the early church. For instance, Hegesippus, who was an early Christian author, mentions that Cleopas was a brother of Joseph. So this was Jesus' uncle. Jesus' uncle didn't recognize him. What's with that? That's the whole point I'm trying to make. Jesus' uncle and his aunt, if this was Cleopas was getting out of town with his wife, Mary, who was also named Mary. What? Well, I had an experience that explained this to me a little bit. My godson, who I knew from the day he was born, went off to college, and I remember when the college year was over, he and all of his friends were crammed into a car and were driving from Texas, which of course this was in the days before cell phones and that sort of thing, so we were terribly nervous. Well, they were going to stay at the house, and so we're all waiting there at the house, waiting for them to get home, and finally they're going to be there at 10, and of course 1 o'clock, and finally they arrive. And bunch of guys at the door, and I opened the door and said, "Well, we've been expecting you." And I said, "Where's my godson?" And this guy standing right in front, and it was a little dark, and the porch light was on, and this kid standing his name was John, and he's standing in front of the door, and he says, "I'm John." It broke my heart. I'd seen that kid 2 or 3 times a week since he was born, and I didn't recognize him. That's because I still thought of him as a little boy. And he went off to school, and this man comes back. In other words, I was seeing him as he was, not as I thought he was. And I really believe that the disciples didn't recognize Jesus because they were seeing him as he was for the first time, not as they imagined or conceived him to be. They were seeing God's love in the flesh in a way they had never seen it. And so it took them a minute to realize, this is Jesus. That's what he really looks like. He's new, he's alive. So this question, people worried that, well, they didn't recognize Jesus. Was he really risen from the dead? Or were they thinking another person was Jesus? No, it was Jesus. Risen from the dead. Touchable. As we said yesterday, when Mary Magdalene kept touching him. This was Jesus, and they were seeing him as he was for the very first time. Now, I should stop, but there's one other thing that I want to add to this. You notice they're walking and they're talking and they're not paying attention, and they talk about this whole thing that happened, and Jesus starts talking quoting Moses and the prophets, and their hearts burned within them. And when they realized it was Jesus, they ran back to Jerusalem, and they said, somebody said, "The Lord has been truly raised and has appeared to Simon." Well, that doesn't say Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John that he appeared to Simon Peter. No, but it says it in the Acts of the Apostles right here. No, this is the gospel. It says it in the gospel. And it also says it in 1 Corinthians, that the first person, there's a tradition that the Lord appeared to the Blessed Mother. I don't know that he had to. I have a feeling that our Blessed Mother knew the minute he rose from the dead that he rose from the dead. I think she had perfect communion with her son because she was immaculate conceived. But, I don't know. I wasn't there. But the first person recorded to have had a vision of Jesus risen from the dead was Simon Peter. We read that here, and we read that in St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, the 15th chapter. So the Lord has truly been raised and appeared to Simon. And then the two recounted what had taken place on the way and how he had been made known in the breaking of the bread. If you are Jewish, before you have a meal, what you do is you wash your hands and you say a prayer. The leader of the meal, the one saying grace, says, "Blessed are you, Lord God of all creation." It's very similar to the prayer that we now use in the offertory. It's the blessing over bread, and a little salt, the bread, and he eats it and passes it on. You cannot talk from the washing of your hands until you eat the broken bread. There's a period of silence because, you see, the commandment is to wash your hands and eat the bread with thanksgiving. And the idea that the rabbis have is that talking between those two things would break the commandment. It would break the mitzvah. So you have to do it in one fell swoop. And this was the first time that these two had shut up. Isn't that interesting? That the first moment of silence in the day, they're talking about all the stuff that happened, and they're walking and they're talking and they're not looking at Jesus. The minute they shut up, they recognized it was Jesus. I think there's a lesson in there. We come into church yakking and glad-handing everyone, and until our souls are quiet, we don't recognize the Lord. So I probably should have started with that and forgot all the rest of the obscure things about things we don't know. But he was made known to them in the breaking of the bread. We always think of that as the Eucharist, and I suspect it was. But he was made known to them in the silence, which was an integral part of the breaking of the bread. I think that's fascinating.
That was the Best of the Week on Relevant Radio. The best way to listen to the Best of the Week is on the Relevant Radio app, free and always free. Download and share the #1 free Catholic app today in the App Store.